right, let's bring in our panel to all of this. We've got Fox Business Network's Edward Lawrence, we've got market watcher Michelle McKinnon, and Deep Digital Chairman Dave Maney. Edward, your thoughts on the no middle ground that the president is laying out here? That tape is going to be there, and we're going to keep going back to that because it's the strongest he's ever been on this issue. It's all or nothing. And consistent with the administration. U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer says that he does not want a partial deal. He's working towards a full deal on this. They would like to see everything included in this. You know, it's interesting, though, you say that American companies are paying these tariffs. 437 of those companies now don't have to pay as many. That's the new items that have been excluded from this list. And it's a large amount of items related.
Well, I was happy to hear Christmas lights now are saved, patio torches are saved, skateboards. Right. I know you're big into that.
Yes, back in my younger days. Right. Electric trucks that are self-propelled electric trucks, which is something Amazon has said that they're going to go towards. So that is also exempted now coming in. So some big items that basically guts a lot of the tariffs that are in place. This is the concessions, though, that the Chinese were looking for. Our Chinese sources were saying that going into this week, they were looking for discussions on rolling back some of the tariffs. And this could be seen as rolling back some of the tariffs. Now, our Chinese sources are saying that possibly we could now see another announcement of a large agriculture buy, either later on today when the statement comes out related to how these talks went, or next week when the smaller part of that group that's here in Washington, or that is in Washington, D.C., goes to the farm countries and visits farms.
You know, Michelle, that it's one thing for the Chinese to say they're going to buy more agricultural goods, though. They don't. Wasn't that the thing that made the last deal fall apart? Because they say they're going to do something, but they don't.
Here's the thing, and kind of to your point of the all or the nothing. I mean, the way that I'm looking at it as, yes, obviously the U.S. economy is much stronger than China at the moment. But I think both parties are now looking, well, hold on a minute. We have a lot to lose. And I think you won't necessarily get a trade deal, but I wouldn't be surprised if we get some type of ceasefire here shortly.
And I'm wondering whether these overtures, Dave, are a step in that direction. The Chinese had already indicated, last week, some of the items we were targeting were going to exempt. I didn't understand what a lot of those items were, like processing oils for fuel widgets or something like that, whatever. But they did that. We do this. In other words, good faith gestures. And that is a little different than prior talks, to Edward's point, that might be setting up something. What do you think?
I think so. And keep in mind, you said it's very black and white, what he said. What he said is very black and white, except when he says all or nothing, it's kind of like what the definition of all is, right? Because trade negotiations are shockingly complex, and Edward could tick off the 3 or 4 things and say, well, this kind of means all. This is the cloud that has no real border of exactly what's included in those elements. So my point
But if you don't deal with intellectual property, the stealing
I agree with that.
Let me ask you, if that's not included, there are going to be enterprising and obnoxious journalists like Edward who are going to be fine sticklers for detail and say, wait a minute, you didn't do that, right?
They are, but what will it mean? I don't think any of us could sit on this panel and say, this is what dealing with intellectual property theft will mean, right? So it becomes very easy for both sides in this to ultimately proclaim victory. When they decide they kind of want to play nice, need to play nice, it's not hard. And Edward can pick it apart. I'm not sure that 300 and some odd million Americans will sit there and say, I really understand that that's not really a victory.
Well, I know a lot of viewers who don't put a final stamp on something until they hear it from this man. And so, Edward, if we get something like that, where we're not quite dotting the I's, crossing the T's on the Chinese trying to play fast and loose with our companies that do business over there, how will that be treated?
But I don't think that's going to happen. I really don't. I think that Robert Lighthizer, the entire administration, has actually been very clear in one voice that they are going to protect intellectual property. They are going to make sure that there is some enforcement in an agreement that
and there will be no deal unless they get that.
And there will be, and that is what the president said. Yeah, there'll be no deal unless they can enforce that.
So there's no wiggle room in your mind.
In my mind, from who I've talked to, all of the folks in D.C., there is no wiggle room on intellectual property. Now, there's also, we're hearing discussions this week about possibly laying out a plan for the Chinese to stop or reduce the number of forced joint ventures. And that's where some of that intellectual property happens, is that if a Chinese company owns 51% of your company, then you have to give up your technology or how you make stuff.
Do you think there's a list of 100 things that they say, if I don't get all 100 of these, Is it that definitive? Because if it is, I'm just saying
I don't know if
nobody in
it's
America
100.
knows what it is.
Right. I don't think it's 100, but I think you're going to have to see some enforcement from the administration, some enforcement in a deal saying that if you break intellectual property, they already have the mechanism. The mechanism is there. They're going to have meetings at the local level, or the monthly meetings with the staff, and then quarterly meetings with the deputy level, and then semi-annual meetings, and all tariffs would be on the table at that semi-annual meeting if a dispute over intellectual property is not set. So that mechanism was agreed upon, and it is there in the deal. They're trying to figure out the language to bind China to that memechanism.
All right, I have no idea what you said, but it sounds very impressive. I'm worried already. No, I know you have an opportunity to talk to the Boston Fed President Rosengren, right?
Eric Rosengren.
And he was the one who was one among the dissenters, arguing, in his case, we don't need any stimulus. So he was against the rate cut. How big is this division?
Well, I mean, it's very divided, Fed. In fact, we had 3 dissensions in this last FOMC meeting.
He would have gone for half a point cut, right?
The Bullard was for, he wanted 50%, right. So, and that's what my point I was getting to, is that the last time we had a dissension on 2 different directions like this of 3 people was in 2014, 5 years ago. So this is a very divided Fed going in here, which way they should go in terms of stimulus for this. Eric Rosengren believes that, if we incentivize people with low interest rates, they will make risky behaviors, risky moves. And he believes that increases the financial risk to the system. And that's basically his philosophy on this problem. Bullard believes, the St. Louis Fed president says, that inflation is basically undershooting. We're looking at deflation possibly in some areas. So we need to use our bullets now before something turns down.
And he's also talking about a manufacturing recession.
And he's talking about a manufacturing recession.
Michelle, let me ask you a little bit about that. Presumably the reason for the quarter-point cut, they wave off the notion, well, the rest of the world's going to zero interest rates. We have to keep up or keep down with that, I guess. But it was the official headline was, we're doing this because of the trade uncertainties. Now, obviously, the Federal Reserve is worried enough about that to keep that vigilance on, that if this really begins to suck the economy, the president says it's not, then they're going to move again. Where does this go?
Not sure. But I think the markets are pricing in an additional cut. Certainly the bond market is pricing in an additional cut.
What's the latest number then? Not for 6 weeks from now, but by the end of the year, we're going to see one more quarter-point cut.
One more quarter-point cut. I mean,
I agree.
Here's the thing. Like, I can understand where both parties that we just mentioned are coming from, right? The U.S. has an extremely strong consumer. There's no need to cut. But then when you look around globally, you have negative yielding rates, and then that's pushing our long-term bonds down, and therefore you get an inverted yield curve. So it's a complicated subject, and I think, the Fed at the end of the day is doing what it thinks is best, and I think trade and the uncertainty of trade is absolutely scaring them.
I'm just wondering, Dave, how far they can push it, right? If, to Edward's point, there's division for whatever reason, you have 3 members dissenting, then I don't know what the next call would have universal support one way or the other.
Yeah, whether it would or not, and frankly, how kind of diluted the weapons have become, right? I mean, you can make an interesting argument that interest rate moves in a world in which we don't have as much company purchase of capital goods. Right? There's much more kind of, I can buy this by the SIP, I can buy this off the cloud, I can do just the piece I need. There is that thing that says to me that the old levers don't work the way they did in a kind of a pre-sharing economy sort of thing. So even if there's bullets still in the armory, I'm just not sure they're quite as deadly as they used to be.
Do you guys think there is significance to this October 1st, 70th anniversary of Communist China, that the Chinese want this settled by then? The administration is trying to lever that date to get a deal. What do you think?
I mean, settled by then, that's not going to happen.
I was going to say, that's
absolutely
highly unlikely.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the administration is showing some good faith, and the Chinese are obviously playing off of that good faith in what their agriculture buys that they're doing. They do appreciate the fact that the increase in tariffs was delayed for 15 days to October 15th. It's an important date to them. I don't think
my own curiosity is if the geopolitical tension between China and the U.S. is fundamentally useful to the Chinese. Because I think if it is, if they're
rallying support
in their kind of hegemonistic sort of world, if it's useful, then my guess is they play with it as long as they want to play with it.
Well,
if it's not useful, they won't.
You buy
we'll
that
be
notion that
interested-
China needs it more than we do, though? I mean, I know
you can
they
see
lie
it in
about their numbers.
You can-
Well, they're growing at a 6% clip. That's 3 times our. Now, I know they lie
If
about
you
it.
believe
I get
them.
agree.
And
But
look at
they're
the
not in a
cash.
depression.
The cash that they're infusing.
Yeah.
The president talks about job losses. We don't know exactly how many job losses they have, but we counted some 50 companies that are either moved their supply chain or looking at moving their supply chain. 35 Chinese companies have notified
they're
their
worried
stock
about that.
markets.
Yeah, but didn't
And
you
that's
think that was
permanent
going to
damage.
happen regardless because the Chinese economy is moving to more of a consumer-based economy?
Could be, except in technology. They're looking to become the manufacturer of all technology. But that going back to that October 1st date, it's interesting to see what happens after that date. If the Chinese are as amenable after that date, now that they've gotten through their
Oh, that's
celebration.
interesting. We haven't done even a sign of something, then we can just
I mean,
wait it
leading
out.
up to it is nice. We need this date because it's our anniversary.
Right.
Afterwards, let's see what happens.
All right. We're going to take a quick break here. Back with Edward Lawrence and Dave Maney and Michelle McKinnon. Edward, any thoughts on this?
On the visit there, I can tell you that I know that they were working on. The Chinese did not say yes right away, but they wanted to see how what the steps would be, where they would go, what they would do. So we understood from sources that they were working out the details of this, and then China would decide if they're going to go or not.
So it wasn't nailed down in the first place.
It wasn't nailed down in the first place, but they would have been face to face with the people they're retaliating against. So that might have been an awkward meeting, and the Chinese maybe
someone might have told guys, this doesn't look good. Something as simple as
these are the
that.
guys you're targeting, and now you're going to go say hello to them.
Go after them with pitchforks or something. Michelle, any read into this? That's how they're being Reuters and the Financial Times, some of these others are seizing on this for this sudden reversal.
I think yes and no. I flat out think the markets already understand that these headlines are just headlines. I think circle
That's all
back
we got
maybe
going, right?
12 months ago.
But it's uncanny. Think of what you just said. It's uncanny. Headlines or bulletins, whether they're backed by fact or that was still on, to Edward's point, they look good for trade. They look good for stocks. They look bad for trade. They look bad for it's uncanny.
Yeah, but
and
Neil,
consistent.
think about this. Okay, we have a what?
And I think it's
100
idiotic. I
point
think it's
down,
idiotic,
94
yeah.
points down. Think about this if it was 12 months ago, right? And we had that kind of headline. I would say the market would have been down 200 to 300 points.
Right.
And the markets now are looking at this as like, it's just a headline. Clearly, we don't know what's going on, and we're not going to overreact.
But they sell first or they buy first.
But they're
based
still
on
talking.
But the moves are
right,
small.
They're
Right.
still talking.
Comparatively.
Absolutely.
And they're going to talk in early October, so the talks are still going on.
Right. What do you make of it?
I hear you that they're going to be a deal and it's going to be a complete deal. I just don't find this president draws really, really bold and well-defined lines in the sand. He has a way of rubbing them out with his foot when he decides that it's expedient for him. So my only caution would be, and he said it today. Okay, he said it today. It doesn't mean he's going to believe it tomorrow. He's not going to change it tomorrow. Yeah. So I think the prospects of something getting done. Again, if China decides it's in its interest to get something done, something will get done. And I don't believe that either the market or the American public has the attention span or the depth of knowledge that you do to dig into those 100 points.
Well, what does
and
that
say,
tell
"What's
you?
that?"
That you hang your hat, for good or ill, on trade bulletins and flashes, even though the macro picture is pretty solid.
It's like being at home when your parents are fighting. Like, does it feel good at dinner when your parents are? It's like, when they're kind of on the same page,
right.
And they're not. Nobody's pulling out the steak knife to stab the other one.
Right.
Dinner's a lot more pleasant.
Yeah, unless you have imaginary friends. I had lots of imaginary. What do you think, Mom and Dad? I got along. All right, so let me get one last thing, Edward. When you get and hear about. The farm thing has always been a big part of this. The president's been looking after the farmers. He wants to, help them out. And they're feeling the effect. Let's talk about the $16 billion for these tariffs that he's.
It's 28 over the past 2 years. Yeah.
Right. So he's taking care of them. So farm is a big part of it, even though we talk about the cheating and everything else. Do you suspect, in whatever final deal we have, that the farmers are going to be richly rewarded here?
Richly rewarded, that, again, depends on your definition. You were talking about what is richly rewarded. I think
Billions
they will be
and billions
rewarded.
more in business than they're getting
They will
now.
be sustainable sales. If we can get to an agreement, you will see sustainable sales plus protections.
Right.
They want that intellectual protection, too, on how they make their crops, genetic engineering.
We have a genetic engineering. Boy, that's holding, isn't it? Right after this. So anyway, back with our panel, Edward Lawrence, Dave Maney, Michelle McKinnon. What do you think, Michelle?
I think it absolutely shows a strong consumer. And I mean, we talk about how strong the consumer is kind of day after day after day. And absolutely, I feel that the consumer will continue to be strong through the holiday season, and probably Apple will benefit. So I think it's all good news.
Davey, what do you think?
Apple itself, I mean, I kind of am a sort of a skeptic. The fact that there's a big line at the New York flagship store is not to me like, oh, isn't this great? And I see the stock's down a couple of bucks today. A company that's scrambling to get into services where the competition is intense, and to me, it's very hard.
You sound like a Galaxy owner.
Yourself. I think they have hit that technology maturity plateau that HP once hit, and that Microsoft hit, and that IBM hit, and I just don't think.
Well, they've got a lot of technology arrows in their quiver. A lot of things they're using, and we don't see too many CEOs who are treated like rock stars.
Well, the marketing is genius. I mean, they're keeping the momentum going, is what they're doing. The market really liked when you talked about the net streaming that they're putting out with their shows and the price point on that. And this is just keeping that marketing going. And it's a marketing machine.
But does it say something, Apple notwithstanding, about, people will pay a lot for something if they like it, if they find it intriguing. But you would think with a lot of the bashing of the economy, we're turning south fast. Well, you don't do that in an economy turning south.
There are certain things people will spend money on. Phones is one of them. We
processed
use it every day.
meats and cheeses.
Processed meats and cheeses.
Imagine if Apple got into that business. Could you imagine?
But people are willing to shell out money for
the
fun.
pepperoni. We're going to take a quick break here with my panel here, Michelle McKinnon. The idea that Emmanuel Macron was a rock star for a little bit. Remember when they all snickered at Trump when he came to visit and all that? And the president, with all his difficulties, all the controversy, is polling better than any of them. The election's still a long way off. But it's a reminder, don't lock in any sort of consensus.
No, and I certainly, the way that I look at it, right, I'm looking at it in terms of a market perspective, and I advise my clients.
I love that about you. It has nothing to do with what's right or wrong. It's just money on it.
But normally, back in 2016, whether you thought Trump was going to win or you didn't, a lot of people thought he was going to lose, and everyone thought that the markets were going to fall because of that. However, if you were a long-term investor and you kind of decided to ignore the noise, you were rewarded. And I think that's a nice reminder, particularly going into the 2020 election, is if you've got that long-term investor mentality, you might need to kind of turn away from the noise.
What do you think?
Here's what I think is the big underlying thing, how the world has driven an ankle biter world now, right? So it is much easier with direct access to consumers and being able to wire around a political party, as Donald Trump did, to get to do things and try them, to throw stuff against the wall and see if it works, and to watch what happens and iterate at very low costs. So what happens is it makes it much harder to be an incumbent anything. That's part of the problem that Apple has, is there's 1,000 guys in a garage in Silicon Valley throwing stuff at the wall because they can do so with very little resources to get started. And only one of those, it's like terrorism. Only one has to work, but the incumbent has to defend against all challenges and every possibility. And so that is the dominant theme of the internet age, is that challenging is easier, being an incumbent, whether it's a corporation or a politician, is harder and more dangerous and more volatile.
No, that's a good insight. Edward, I was thinking that with the Australian Prime Minister and the President, neither of those guys were expected to be where they are. And yet, here they are. I'm just wondering, when you talk to people at the White House and all of that, do they worry about these polls? They worry about all this stuff that could be fleeting? Or?
No, I haven't heard worry about the polls. I think the president's secure in his base. From just the feeling I get out of the White House is that he's very secure, that farmers are with him, his base is with him. So then they look past the polls. I mean, look what happened to the polls in 2016.
No, you're right. AB, that's what they're hanging their hats on, right?
Yeah, well, being secure in his base is not likely to be enough if there's an incredibly energized turnout on the left, which Republicans that I talk to are worried about. And so after 2018, they really saw a much broader, deeper coalition come out in a midterm election. That doesn't bode well if you're a Republican for the presidential cycle. The president's base is not the majority. It's not a plurality to win. He needs to register new voters. He's not governing to a bigger coalition. He's not in the persuasion business. So he better hope every farmer turns out, and then he's going to have to get some new voters around the edges to make sure he secures an electoral college victory.
Well, unless other voters on the other side don't show up. We'll see. But I had one viewer here just say, hey, Neil, don't forget about Ulysses Grant. And no idea what that means. But we have a lot more. We got the Dow down 128 points here. Again, concern increasingly about this canceled farm meeting. But we'll have a lot more on that. Yeah. All right. We are learning here that this sell-off might have had everything to do with that planned tour, the Montana farm tour. That was canceled at the last second, apparently for good reason. We're told it was on the heels of the president's remarks that he wouldn't accept a partial deal as soon as the Chinese delegation that was to visit these, it was supposed to be a series of Montana farms, they canceled. So that's an interesting development in and of itself. Edward Lawrence, what do you make of it?
Chinese watching every word the president says and the president tweets. There was a phone call, we understand, from Beijing to the delegation here saying cancel the trip.
So did they think that they were working on a separate track to, an initial deal with the thornier stuff later?
I mean, that's what the Chinese would like to do. They would like to deal with some of the harder stuff.
And they must have been under the impression that could be in the works, and the president made it clear that it's
or they were trying to just get that to that direction in order to do these talks. But yeah, clearly they were listening, didn't like what they heard, and said, no, you're not going to go.
What do you think, Michelle?
I think it's a little bit to save face. I mean, the tit for tat.
You're very jaded for someone so young.
I'm jaded in the sense of, I think it only matters until we have something, whether that's like a ceasefire or a trade deal.
But clearly they were under a different impression, right? I mean, don't
they have to do that because they want to seem strong, right? I mean, we would probably do the same thing, no?
They had a strategy. They were going to cancel this the last second.
Could.
What do you think?
You're reading the tea leaves from people who drink a lot of tea.
This is a nerd's version of a black helicopter story, and you'll have to work with me on this. But it does, on the crazy surface, make a little sense if the president is maybe or has led people to believe that he's open to a partial deal, and all of a sudden he's saying unequivocally not, and they hear that someone from Beijing calls this delegate. You're not going.
But if, as Edward says, and I believe you're right, that the Chinese are hanging on Donald Trump's every word, that could drive anyone insane. So the fact that they're not going to show up in big sky country tomorrow is probably not in the long run.
I think they don't know how to read him. I think they literally don't with all the communication.
They must have been under the impression, though, that he was open, because you and I were just talking about this the other day, that, hey, they might be open to another deal or watering something down, getting something better than getting nothing. And he makes it clear, no.
Or it could just be that the goodwill, we have goodwill on both sides, goodwill on our side, goodwill on their side. All of a sudden he came out with a very harsh statement. So now they need to respond to save face. It could just be as simple as that.
Well, but he put up the ante by saying, you know what, I'm going to reimpose those tariffs. And those
but then tomorrow, Neil, he could change his mind.
What do you think happens?
I think you get closer and closer to these talks. I don't think you're going to have dramatic improvements or non-improvements. I think also to think about the election, the Chinese economy, our economy. Yes, things look really good, but, I think he's also kind of a bit concerned that he doesn't want to overstep his boundaries here.
And the president did say that he does not believe there could be a trade deal, or he's not looking for a trade deal before the election. He said, if in his comments.
If it happens, great. If it
happens, great. If it doesn't, he's fine with that.
But he does say different things.
Yes, he does. Look, I don't think any of us here, I don't think any of us thinks this just drives into some wider and wider gulf that becomes, uncontrollable. And given that, I think a general sense of optimism probably prevails.
All right, well, I'm blaming Edward Lawrence. Sorry, buddy, but this is all I knew. We were doing hunky-dory.
My fault.